measures, and then as well as, some housekeeping measures. This is a traditional disclaimer that we have. The views, opinions, and content expressed in this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policies of the Center for Mental Health Services, CMHS, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, otherwise known as SAMHSA, and the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide. There's just a few reminders. Please keep your phones on mute if you're not taking part in the discussion. As well as, one of the issues is basically, believe it or not, we can pretty much pick up all kinds of noise that's going on. So if you're not talking, as well as if you're in a space where there's other people speaking or coming in and out, we recommend that you put your phone on mute. We also recommend that you mute your PC speakers. That often causes a lot of disruption and some static. Please do not put your phones on cold. We don't want to hear your hold music. And we'd also like you to know that we are recording this webinar. Okay. So Dietra, without further ado, we're going to turn it over to you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting us on and getting this organized. We will see what we can get through today and hopefully have some opportunity with the people who are participating to have some exchanges back and forth. I'm going to be inviting Adria to jump in at different times to also add some commentary just so we can continue to have some conversation today. So the hope for today is to, for me, is always to introduce asking a different question in the work that we are doing. If we think about being trauma-informed, for example, we ask the question of what happened to you as a way of kind of creating an opening. And in the work that I've been doing really for a very long time, the key thing that a lot of people find that's very helpful is to talk about dialogue and not just debating. And so we'll go through what that means specifically, as well as just getting at some various terms and being able to think about the importance of where people are coming from a cultural perspective. So I'm going to see if this is good. Yeah, so what we like to do, which is actually to model recovery, is to start off by asking people, what are your hopes for this session today? And we're hoping that you can use the chat box, I believe, for that. That would be, really helpful. So we're going to look here at the chat box and see what would be some of your hopes for this session. Again, with the title being initially cultural competence, responsiveness, being agile, and more. The terms tend to be a little bit confusing sometimes when we think about what do we mean by being culturally competent. There's a lot of work around people talking about being more culturally humble. We'll get into some of those terms, but I wanted to get an idea of what people would like to learn about or hear about for today. So. And
Dietra, right away, I just want to thank you around kind of, demystifying or at least beginning a discussion about the terminology, because depending upon what state you are, depending upon the kinds of training you may get in the state or locality, as well as what resources you utilize, those terms are really used interchangeably, and often, they may not mean the same thing, but we don't really have a frame of reference for really distinguishing one from another. So Sarah, Marvin, and Melissa, they want to hear about what other people are doing with clients for this and what the term agility means. Wow, what a great question. And Pete says he doesn't have any specific hopes. He really is just really interested in learning more. So
that's great.
I think you've got a tall order.
Well, the awesome thing about starting off with asking this question is it gives me a frame, gives us a frame for what some of the questions are out there. And as you said, these terms are often used very interchangeably. And so how we actually understand them, how we interact with them can be very different. So just to quickly address the issue around agility, if I can, because it's one of my favorite ones to think about right now. And then we can talk about some of the things as we move forward. I was a former athlete. I ran track. And when I think about being agile and the work that we do in terms of cultural competency, there has been this tendency in the past for cultural competency to be like a one-time thing. So I would not think that I was going to be very successful in winning a race if I was only practicing that day to win the race, at that time. And so the idea about talking about being culturally agile is really just introducing that there's a bunch of different things that we need to do to be successful. If we're going to think about being a team, that means that we need to work together. We need to know what your strengths are, what my strengths are, and figure out how we leverage those so that we can, score the point. That would be one way to think about it. And then agility is another way in terms of how we think about this. Your components or the people you're going to be, competing against are going to have different strengths at different times. And so you're going to have to be able to pivot, be able to have a different, set of skills and tools that you use in order to be successful. And so as we think about being more culturally agile or culturally competent or even humble, I think that we have to do things on a regular basis. We have to work with others who might not work with us typically. We have to think about increasing our tools, and we might have to also learn to adapt because there are things that, as I get older, I can't do in the same kind of way, but I'm still going to be competitive. And so we have to learn how to do things in a different kind of way based on the settings and based on our own background and the things that we are dealing with. But we'll talk some more about that, and hopefully I like to start off asking about hope, primarily because hope is the one thing that we absolutely need in order to be successful in supporting anybody's recovery. So some objectives for today that I think will match up with some of the questions that were put forward are to explore what are some of these terms, concepts that are out there, how do we work with that. I hope that we walk away today thinking about how the kinds of questions that we ask can help us learn different things, and that there are a number of different strategies that we can use based on the communities that we're in that are going to be more congruent with others. And then an important thing is to recognize when trust has been broken and to think about what are some of the skills that we need to repair trust and how that fits within a cultural context. So those are our objectives. I always like to acknowledge where we're coming from with this work. And the beginning part of that is to recognize that many workshops and some people feel like all we need to do is be nice or be colorblind. We also might go to a workshop or a training and identify everything that's going wrong and kind of talk at people. There's this whole list. There's nothing wrong with any of these things that's on the list. The thing that ends up kind of getting people stuck is that you do one instead of doing them all. And if we think about, when we start to talk about what we mean by culture, we want to think about it in a much more holistic way, just like we think about health and wellness in a more holistic way. So it's great to have cultural potlucks and posters and information that is put up, but it can't be the only thing that we do. It's going to be important to do assessments of your community and who you serve, and making sure that you're hiring people who are representative of who you serve. The mistake sometimes that takes place is that there's an assumption that the people who you're serving are not qualified or not in a position to work at your establishment. And there are a number of different ways that we can strategically and from a cultural competency perspective be involved in, working with our schools, working with community, the community colleges to actually have a pipeline for people who are representative of our communities so that they are part of the workforce and available to help us in providing more culturally competent, more culturally congruent services. There's also a heavy emphasis on evidence-based practices. The question I always ask there is whose evidence are we looking at? And we are doing better with thinking about being more inclusive about the people who we create randomized trials on. But we also have to just be mindful of how an evidence-based practice may not be evidenced on the community that we're trying to work with. And take time in all of our initiatives to think about how our policies and procedures, if they are being driven by the people who are being impacted by those policies and procedures, or are they coming from a different source. So diversity initiatives are important to be inclusive, and I hope kind of from what I've already started to present, you can see that it's multi-layered and that really the first thing I think is to start with where you have some openings. So, Adria, I don't know if you are on speaker voice. Would you mind reading this definition for me?
Yes. Culture, defined as the integrated pattern of thoughts, communications, actions, customs, beliefs, values, and institutions associated wholly or partially with racial, ethnic, or linguistic groups, as well as with religious, spiritual, biological, geographical, or sociological characteristics. Culture is dynamic in nature, and individuals may identify with multiple cultures over the course of their lifetime.
Thank you. Just recently this year, there was a special edition with National Geographic as they as an organization have started to acknowledge their role in perpetuating stereotypes about various ethnic groups and starting to really explore what we mean by culture, and that just looking at someone in the way that they look, like we look at these two little girls who are sisters, that we don't assume that they can't be related, and that there's actually more to culture than just looking at what someone's physical appearance is. It's a great issue to get and to explore and to look into, and I like being able to acknowledge what's happening currently as organizations are starting to really look at what role they've played in either helping to support a broader understanding of culture or to keep people in thinking and only scanning for information that confirms sort of the buckets that they think about. So I always like to start off with this definition. It does come from the CLAS standards, the Cultural and Linguistically Appropriate Services standards, and not everybody is familiar with those. Love to see a show of hands if there are people who are willing to acknowledge that they've started to look at them or use them. But the first thing, so that could be one, is I also would like in the chat box for you to try to answer what you see going on in this picture that we're going to show here. And of course, I'm hoping that most people have seen this picture, but what would you describe as happening in this picture? What are the kids trying to do? Yay, they're doing some cheering, yeah. Or at least some of them are trying to, right? They're trying to watch the baseball game. Excellent. Okay, and so we have a bigger answer here. When you treat everyone the same, they're not getting their individual needs met. Great, that's helping to kind of propel us through for what this conversation is about. I'm going to show another picture that's also another rendition of a similar version that's been, has circled the internet for a while. So I asked a very specific question about what the kids are trying to do because I think sometimes we're not aware of how powerful our questions are. And that when we ask people, we could have people focus in on just the words equality and equity, and then that tends to raise some questions in my experience. We could ask people to focus in on the boxes, and that's going to lead to a different kind of discussion. I find that we have to be very mindful of the kinds of questions that we are asking, and particularly if we are wanting people to think creatively about what's possible. So not to get in too much about equity and equality and the pictures that have come from this conversation, but really to think about how the questions that we ask can really help us think outside of the box. So if we said, what were the kids trying to do, one solution as we see in the picture is to redistribute the boxes so that people can see, so that the kids can see the game. But there are many different things that we could do if that was the question that we are looking at. Here we have an example of you could take the fence down or invite the kids into the game. I've also done this exercise with many people, and they'll talk about, cutting a hole, inviting them in, giving them a ticket, bringing them in, they'll get really creative about multiple different ways in which you can meet everybody's needs instead of just meeting one, and recognizing that there are lots of different solutions if we ask a different kind of question to the things that we're trying to do. And if we're open to those different solutions, then we create a space for people to choose, so there's more of this opportunity for self-determination, as well as a recognition that sometimes the answers that we're looking for are not always directly in front of us, but sometimes those answers are, sort of outside of our lens or maybe even outside of our field. And I think from a perspective of thinking about being more culturally competent, more culturally agile, thinking about how we are, in my terms, the way I like to think about cultural competency, what are the things that I experience or have experienced in my life that help me to engage people? And what are some of the things that have been in my experience in my life that maybe create a little bit of a hesitation? And then what are some of the things that I can do that support me, that help me to push past some of that discomfort? Because there are always going to be things that make us uncomfortable. And we have to be able to, I think, together come up with some of the solutions for what that might be. So before we go any further with this work, I always like to let people know how I think about doing this work. And to begin with, I believe that everything we do exists within some kind of cultural context. And as we started off with, we have a very broad definition of culture. I also believe that there really is no endpoint to this process. And the more we do the work, I think the more we'll discover about things that we can change and adapt, and that's actually kind of exciting. The more that we work, especially with young people, then I think we find that they take us in places that help us to think differently about how we provide care and support for people. So it's an ongoing process. There really is a journey. We do have to be aware of where we're coming from. What are the filters that we have in our work? And if we're aware of our filters, then that helps us to know that other people are coming in with filters as well. And primarily what I liked about this is that it helps me not get mad when someone comes in and they have a certain expectation for what I'm supposed to be doing, because they have their own filter just like I have my filter. And it's on me to be able to address that and to kind of work within wherever they might be coming from. It's also important in this work to recognize that sometimes when we have a cookbook approach, as was stated before, if we do things, treat everybody the same way, we might not be meeting those individual needs. So a how-to cookbook can promote more stereotyping. There is this understanding, though, in our social science that an aspect of stereotyping, not stereotyping itself, but an aspect of stereotyping is actually naturally part of what we do. We naturally put people, we put information, we put things that are coming to us our brains categorize them. The opportunity we have is that we can choose whether or not we act on those initial thoughts and the initial boxes that we have, or if we use some of our skills to be able to push past that. I believe in our work that we all have a role to play. Sometimes I like to say that we're here to witness, and sometimes we are here to testify. I think it's more and more and more important that we have many different stories that are told about lived experience, about what it means to be well, and that those stories are not just told in one particular way, that we actually create a variety of platforms, if that's through music, if that's through movement, if that is through traditional narrative, if that is using fiction, that we have to have multiple ways in which we hear those stories. And that the last thing I like to share in terms of doing this work is that I don't think it's helpful to try and identify who we're going to blame. I've never really seen identifying the group to blame then move us in a direction of wellness and hope. There's a way of establishing where some things come from, kind of looking at our historical legacies and those sorts of things, but for the most part, all of us here are really just responding to the institutional legacies that we've all inherited. So to share a piece, I'm going to invite Adria to help me with this, and would Laverne or Ashley, would you like to help out with this as well?
Yeah, sure. And this
Okay.
is although we're using Ashley's login for purposes, it's Amelia who's here with us.
Amelia, I'm so sorry. I'm looking at the name, and I remember it's you.
Yeah.
So
let us know when you want us to join in.
Well, I would like one person to take dialogue to read and another person to read debate.
You take dialogue and I'll take debate?
Okay.
Well,
you are an attorney.
All right.
I am an attorney. That's my natural place to be. Yes.
Okay. Thanks, Amelia.
Okay, go ahead. Okay.
So being collaborative, two or more sides work together toward a common understanding.
And debate is oppositional. You know, you got two sides that oppose each other, and my goal is to convince you that you're wrong.
Whereas I'm going to try and find some common ground.
For me, winning is everything, Amelia.
I can listen to you. I can hear what you're coming from. I'm going to try to understand what you mean, and maybe we can find some sort of agreement.
Here's the deal. As you're talking to me, I'm already thinking about my argument against what you're saying. And, I'm just listening to you, Amelia, to find flaws in your argument and to make counter-arguments.
What is it that you're hoping that by countering my argument you might possibly change my view?
Well, I'm not really looking for that. I just want to affirm, you to hear where I'm coming from, Amelia.
All right. Well, I guess I'm just going to assume that perhaps you need to reevaluate.
No. What I say, what I think, and what I view is the absolute, unequivocal truth, Amelia. Go ahead. Dialogue? We're not done yet, Amelia. You can't exhale.
I'm thirsty.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I'll take a second to try and look at my own positions and understand why I came to the assumptions I did.
I'm ready to critique your other positions. I mean, I don't see any value in really being introspective.
Well, maybe we could discuss why you feel your way. What is it that led you to that? Because maybe we could find a type of a solution that might be better than just your original idea or mine.
I happen to think that defending a person's position is the best solution, and it's either my what I believe or it doesn't register.
All right. Well, and what you believe might be very similar to what other people believe. So it's not as if you're wrong, but it might be nice to incorporate what you say with what some other people are saying.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way of looking at it. I mean, what I found is that, debating, it can create a closed-mind attitude and a determination, to be right and not really kind of look at another person's point of view.
Sure. And that makes sense. You know, sometimes by looking at someone's point of view that you don't necessarily agree with will improve the other person's opinion anyways.
Yeah.
And maybe through that you'll be able to enhance your initial idea.
Yeah, that's true, because when a person submits, you know, their own best thinking and you're caught up really in defending it, you know, against any sort of challenge, you're really just caught up in defending. You're not really listening to what anybody has to say. So really, I can see the value in dialogue, particularly around differences and different perspectives.
I'm glad to hear that. It was a really great turnaround.
That was a great turnaround.
That was great.
As an attorney, it's very hard. It's very hard to endorse dialogue, but I shall.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome. I just
Well,
feel inside the brain, you know.
I should say that everywhere we go, people talk about the skills that they've all learned are all in debate. And I don't know, Adria, did you want to maybe share a little bit on that and your experience with this, sharing this information with people?
Sure. I just want to say that was the best reading of the dialogue and debate that I have ever seen since I started doing this. But as Dietra was saying, we were at recently we were with a school system, and one of the teachers raised his hand. He said, well, you learn how to dialogue after you've been married for 5 years, because most of the time we're debating. And I think I was on my debate team, and that's what I learned how to do, how to critique the other's position and find the flaws and make sure that what I'm saying could be determined as the right way to go, or the best thinking. Like, this is the best thinking because I'm saying it. And what we find is that most of us are not really dialoguing, that most of the time we're debating.
Yeah. And the skills that we need to be able to dialogue are, you know, there are few opportunities in school. There are few opportunities if you think about what we see on TV. If most of the adults that we know watch the news, they never see someone have an exchange like you just did today, you know, where you were actually going, well, I can see where you're coming from. There's usually this kind of cutting in and sometimes even yelling at each other instead of actually trying to listen and thinking about how we're going to expand. I came to really focus on dialogue after doing a review of various diversity training initiatives over many years ago, actually during the Clinton administration, and they had put together a compendium of the various workshops and availabilities for addressing diversity. And the most common element, of course, or maybe it isn't, of course, but the common element for all of those things was dialogue, and really creating a space for people to be heard and to have this experience of being truly listened to. And so when you think about the kind of work that we do in mental health, many of the people that we are trying to work with and support, whether we're trying to be culturally competent or not, this is just good care. They want to be heard and believed. And so our skills for dialogue are very important. It's also one of the things that I think allows us to know, do we want to stay in this engagement or not? Is this a person who is actually trying to listen to me, or are they just trying to convince me that I should do something a particular way? And so you can get caught up in debating on whether or not, for example, this medication is good for you, or debating with the judge on whether or not you really need treatment or not. And sometimes what that does is it pushes people into a corner, and they defend that corner whether it is actually to their benefit or not. And we have to be aware of whether or not we're putting a person in that position of being able to, you know, save face, essentially, to have some sense of their own humanity, to have a sense of their own worth, by not debating them, but actually trying to use dialogue as a skill. So some questions that we had asked and wanted to get some ideas around and maybe hear from you. You all come from a variety of different teams and supporting people who really in many cases tend to be our most difficult to serve, and you're trying to help them, stay in the community. What would you say are some of the successes that you've had, if you can think of who those people are, and what worked for them, what worked for your team in supporting them and being out in the community? Another question to think about for those individuals, as you see here, are what do the individuals that you serve really care about? And I've done a lot of work with the Georgia ACT teams at one point, and we asked this question. And it can be kind of difficult in the beginning to think about what people really care about, but we heard everything from there's one person who collected cassette tapes still, and had like a boom box that they walked around with. And what they talked about later, why that was so important, is that no one could take that stuff away from him. And that if you have something digital or on the phone, then it was easy for those things to break and not work. And so he was very focused on having his music with him at all times and not being separate from that and not having to depend on technology or like an internet connection like a lot of us do these days. So just curious about what are some of the people who you've worked with that you think of were successes, what worked for them. For those people, what were some of the things that you know that they really cared about? And then another question for you all is, what do you and your team in the work that you're doing, trying to keep people out into the community, out of, hospitalized care, inpatient care, what do you have a passion for?
Yeah. Well, Sarah, Marvin, and others, and Melissa are writing in the chat box, but I'll get it started because of the work I do.
Okay.
When I think of my successes, who comes to mind? I think, what comes to mind to me is someone who has perhaps, been in the system for years and years and years and suddenly finds him or herself and is able to live in the community independently and actually, take care of him or herself. What worked for them and what worked for them, I think, was number one, me being a role model as a person, who lives with bipolar disorder and was able to kind of, talk to the person about what strategies, but also understand in a really personal way what the person was talking about and what their challenges were. Because I think in the absence of really being empathetic and understanding and saying, yeah, I understand, I go through that myself, that was helpful. What worked for our team is really to encourage folks to really talk openly and honestly about their challenges, and for peers who are working who are on webinars or who are part of our affinity groups, for them to kind of work through solutions on their own. The folks that we serve I would say in a very broad way, because we provide technical assistance to SAMHSA grantees. I think the individuals that we work with really care about justice and really making a difference in people's lives, of really transitioning folks to recovery. And here what we have a passion for is really ensuring that, that our prisons, our jails, and long-term institutions don't continually criminalize or pathologize mental illness, substance use. And so we have a passion for really educating folks around those issues and, talking to folks about alternatives. So we have some responses here, Dietra. Sarah, Marvin, and Melissa say that one of their successes is that their client B has made a great turnaround. They say that it's taken a lot of engagement and the team helping her to get her money in order and shopping to get her to trust us. Wow. They say that patience is the key and that their team is very passionate about clients' independence and housing and the ability to, I think they may have hit send a little prematurely.
Oh, no.
Oh, okay. Okay. And to move freely around town and to meet their needs. So it's really about integrating folks becoming reintegrated back into community life. I think we had one other comment before that one. Maybe. Yeah. Okay. No, we got that. Leslie or yeah. Do you have any comments? Would you like to share with us via the chat box, kind of answering those questions? Yeah. Well, Adria and Dietra, I would say basically from our conversations with the various teams that work with the Assistant Outpatient Treatment Program, that what Melissa and her colleague, who are from Cleveland, really identify as what their passions are, their approach, and how important engagement is. That it's what we hear across.
It's what you hear on a regular basis.
Yeah. That folks are don't view assistant outpatient treatment as an end in and of itself, but really sort of an opportunity to really get for folks to get the support services they need and really lead a successful life in the community.
Yeah. I've always, I really value and appreciate the work that these teams do, because there is that very intense work that's not easy of getting people those just basic needs and really meeting them where they are. And that I think it takes a very special person to be able to do this kind of work and to kind of stay in it and not get burnt out. And to me, one of the things that's important about not getting burned out, which to me fits in with being culturally competent, is that we identify what our successes are, that we take time as a team to talk about what's working for folks, that we even make sure that we memorialize what those things are that have helped our individuals, you know, and that the little things really do matter, and that sometimes it isn't about the big things. It isn't just about, you know, someone accepting a diagnosis. It's very much about just being able to do ordinary, regular things, to move about freely, and to be asked about the things that they care about and what they have passion for, and that the teams also have that, and that they can see successes in what they're doing. So I like to always start off by asking those kinds of questions and then thinking about how can we use that to further the work that we do, and not just look for what some of the gaps might be. And some work that I did some years ago with the school system, that was one of the things that we started off doing, which was to kind of shift the focus on who and what we focus, where we put our energy. So hopefully some of you have probably heard the story about the healing forest. The idea or the story behind this is that there was a tree that the community really cared about, and it was dying. It was in their town center. And so in order to try and help this tree come back to life, they took the tree and they took it out to the forest among, you know, other trees, and it started to come back. It was doing better. And so once it was doing better, they brought it back into the town center. And unfortunately, it started to die and wither again. So what they learned is that it wasn't about removing an individual or removing the tree. It was really about thinking about the community supports that are needed for that tree to flourish on its own. And that when I think about the kind of work that we're doing, that your organizations here do, it's providing the supports in the community that help the individual, not just focusing in on the individual or thinking that we take the individual out of the community fix them and then return them, but that there will be ongoing things that we have to do in our community so that individuals can flourish where they might be. And I think those stories are important because very often we tend to focus on finding the problem, fixing the problem, and not necessarily thinking holistically that there might be a lot of different things that we need to do. And if you think about planting, then you know that it's more than just fertilizer, that's needed, and that taking time to even talk to our plants, right, makes a big difference in the work and whether or not they're flourishing or not. So to kind of move forward and also just offer, I know that you all are monitoring the chat box. So if there are things that are coming up that you have questions about, please add that in and they'll kind of let me know if we need to stop and focus in on that. But I want to be mindful of getting through a little bit of information here. So we want to talk about what the key terms are, but I always start off by introducing that we can ask some different questions first. So the CLAS standards here is a link to those standards, and I thought are we going to try and go to that link so you can just see what the website looks like?
Yep, I'm just going to have to stop sharing the PowerPoint for a quick sec, and then I'll share my screen. Sure, and then here we go.
Ooh.
Yay, look at this. So this is your catch-all. There are a ton of resources here, and they're all free. So when you go to this website, you can find information, videos, you can get assessment tools. In some ways, it's probably overwhelming because there is so much information here. But I always like to at least let people know that we have this resource and that there are many different ways to think about being culturally and linguistically appropriate that are not just about, how we hire people. They're not just about policies, and that, for organizations that are striving to be culturally competent, there are strategies that they can use. And just like we work with people, we'll meet you where you're at. So identifying the things that you're doing well already, and then where can you expand from that. Have you all had a, thank you. Yeah, I always want to make sure that people know that resource.
Okay, yeah, it's a great resource. Okay.
Just 1 second, let me pull this back up.
No problem.
Takes a minute.
It takes just a quick second.
Yep.
So the thing about CLAS and thinking about being culturally and linguistically appropriate in our services and support is highlighting the importance of talking about and understanding the importance of equity, and how when we focus in on, for example, maybe one cultural group that we're trying to serve in our community, there's the great likelihood that we improve all of the quality of our services, and that we, in our field and for the last, unfortunately, 30 plus years, we continue to have racial and ethnic disparities, and that there are ways that we know and things that we can do to help address what those disparities are. So we need CLAS at every point of contact, and I like to make sure that people are aware that we're not just talking about who you hire and you train, and that you provide trainings that are ongoing and actually meaningful for individuals, if that's important. But it's also important to think about how we do community engagement. So if you are thinking about how you want to engage your community, we recently were talking with an organization that's doing some community outreach and sharing about recovery. And what they said is that, we had these information sessions all the time, but we were only focused on our individuals and their family. We weren't talking to the community, and so they decided to partner with a local mall, and they have their Recovery Month events out in the parking lot of a local mall. They provide haircuts and hot dogs and music, but it's not simply just having something kind of in their corner that in some ways has just stayed within the population that they serve, but it's actually about educating the whole community and going where people are at. The other piece about being culturally and linguistically appropriate is that we do have to think about where our organizational policies are and what supports being innovative in some of the things that we do. And sometimes there are policies that are in place that when we don't look at them with multiple stakeholders in the room, we may not catch something that really does need to be addressed in terms of supporting people. So I know that none of your organizations do this, but one of our organizations that we worked with realized that they were not providing, they had access for people who were working out in the field to have a cell phone, but the cell phone policy and procedure was like the lowest bid, and so we work with people who are out in rural areas, and their phones weren't working. And so it was the individuals who were being served who spoke to this. They were the ones who said, we want our clinicians, our people who are helping us, to actually have cell phones that work and to be able to access those things quickly. And so that was an organizational policy that had to be reviewed because it was having an impact out in the community. They had a phone, but it wasn't usable. We want to think about how CLAS impacts the effectiveness of our services and supports, whether or not we are providing linguistically appropriate services and access, whether or not we are thinking about the importance of that over time with every person that they meet with. So not just making sure that there's interpretation when they're meeting with maybe the psychiatrist, but that there's that opportunity throughout, and that we're not using family members, for example, right? It's also important that we think about having diverse funds. So if you're in a position of running an organization, CLAS is important at that level, as well as, and I think almost more importantly, in your board development. I've seen a number of organizations have programs that did not get to continue because they were not educating their board about the various things that they were doing to actually support people in being more culturally competent. So they lost out because their boards weren't in support of these innovative projects that were taking place. The more we're culturally competent, more importantly than anything else, it helps to build rapport and trust. We recognize that it increases our effectiveness, and that it's something that from the person who answers the phone to the person who is doing transportation or even, kind of doing some of the janitorial type things, that it's important that we are providing opportunities for them to be culturally competent and aware of what we mean by that. So here are some of the different groups, that broad definition that we shared earlier, we may think about in terms of cultural competence. And people are doing various things in all of these different domains. One of my favorites is thinking about English proficiency and whether or not we provide, for example, in our brochures, the language in the brochures, does it actually speak to, like, is it ordinary enough that people know that this is where they're coming to get help? Or do we talk about, kind of use our clinical language in some of the work that we do? So cultural competency has a way of impacting even the way that we do our brochures, what our websites need to look like, and whether or not we are being invitational to everybody, spirituality being an important component of that. People who have lived experience with the incarceration community, so criminal justice and all of those different dimensions, and especially thinking about the important role of lived experience, as was already noted earlier in this conversation. So when we think about the different levels that we need to be aware of, we want to think about what's happening on an individual level. We want to think about what's happening organizationally. And we also want to think about our impact in our systems. And sometimes that can be very frustrating to realize that there's a role for us to play in educating the community, policing, to be doing work with our banks who maybe are not thinking about how they can provide services to even, to our folks as well. But there's ways to think about this broadly that's not just about sort of the basics. The basics are important, but those basics have an impact across. So even in our shelters, we have to think about how we're supporting them and being culturally competent. So a simple definition, again, of these terms is just to think about the extent to which we are being effective, and that's the idea of really looking at who are you serving and are you being effective, and are you asking them in what ways can you be more effective? Do we require that our services are provided within a particular time frame? Or in a particular context. And numbers of organizations, which I'm sure you all are doing as well, offer support, 24 hours instead of just trying to, have care that's from 9 to 4. So organizations that are culturally competent, this would be something to think about, and I'd love to know if you feel like this is something your organizations are doing. They value diversity. In their assessments, like when you have your own personal assessment as an employee, are there questions in there that address cultural competency? Where in the vision and mission or values is there a clear statement about how they support being culturally agile, for example? In what ways and examples would you say that they are valuing the dynamics of difference, institutionalizing that knowledge and creating opportunities for more diversity to be grown, especially if we start to think about the use of technology in some of our work and being flexible around some of those things. And then another way to just think about this is, kind of looking at this continuum. And you can talk about this from an individual level. You can talk about this scale also organizationally. And the way I like to just point things out is that most of the time when you're working with someone and they say that they just see everybody the same way, then they're kind of in the middle of what we think about being truly culturally competent and agile. And that the work of this, because it isn't a journey, we're always learning and you never really arrive, is that you're actively learning new things. You're actively educating yourself and others about what those differences are, that it's not enough to just say that you're doing what, something kind of internally, but you're actually taking that information out, which is why I like that example of providing recovery information out in the mall where everybody is, and not just talking about providing resources and supports kind of within our own walls or within our own organizations, but that we actually go out into the community and that we are sharing that information broadly. So I like to make sure that people know that if you're at all confused, you should be. And this has been years in the making, that we just have a number of different terms that we use for being culturally competent. I think it's probably okay to have multiple different terms, but it's important to know that there are different terms and then to ask people what they mean by that. So early on we heard that, a lot of these terms get used kind of interchangeably. Responsive, aware, proficient. Some years ago, there was an article that came out that had documented over 150 different ways in which we talk about multiculturalism, diversity, and cultural competency, and just saying that there is a lot of terminology confusion. And so what we really like, especially if we use the CLAS standards, is that the more you're aware of the different things that go into being culturally competent, the better off we are. So I like to introduce this idea of conditioning and discrimination. And I use this really as a frame for thinking about the way we create trust with individuals. And so this is a cycle. It's called the cycle of conditioning. And the way that the cycle works is that you have a trusted individual or source that gives information. But in a cycle of discrimination, the information tends to be, some pieces tend to be missing, or they divide people into groups, a superior group and an inferior group. So it's a trusted source that gives misinformation. The next step in this cycle is to separate the groups into the superior and inferior so that they can't get to learn and know about each other. There's a process of pointing out difference that then can become internalized and tends to be acted out and justified. So I like using this frame for cultural competency in particular and the type of people that we work with because I think it ends up applying to almost any label that you want to put in that misinformation bucket. So if we want to put in the label around gender, we can do that. If we want to put in the bucket around, recently I've been talking with people who are working in the substance use community, and there's, abstinent-based and harm reduction, and then maybe they're also talking about mental health. And I don't know if you all and your some of the people that you're working with, if they have a preference for being able to talk about substance use, medicated assisted support, or other diagnoses where there tends to be sometimes a separation of, well, this is what I live with, and I don't have to deal with that over there. But instead of really looking at what things we have in common. So yeah. I use this cycle to just draw out what some of those things are. Is someone going to jump in?
Sure, yeah, I wanted to share something with you. I think I've been doing this work for 21 years, some of it in inpatient facilities, some of it out in the community, and even within, let's say, the consumer community, and folks providing services to them, there's sort of a hierarchy. There's the higher functioning people who suffer from these kinds of diseases, and then there's the lower functioning people who typically are, the schizophrenics or others, and then there's a group
the terms that we use.
Yeah, and then there's another group who totally, can't be helped, and those are typically what I've heard, people really say as well as clinicians, those are women with quote-unquote personality disorders. And you use those terms to define, and what it does is people get a little bit of information, and it's kind of, and so even within our community, there's that, those people, so.
Yes. So we see this kind of cycle, which is basically misinformation, right, about whatever that label might be. And it doesn't end up really mattering which group we're trying to talk about if we're getting into this. So, but what I hope we do, and what I think cultural competency to me allows us to do, is to say that we all have filters, and that we need to all be aware of the different ways in which we can help to disrupt this process. So the way I do that is I ask people those questions that we started off with. What actually do the individuals that you work with say help them to start off with? What do you see, what do you see them doing that you recognize actually helps them, and what are some of the things that get in the way? And those are questions that are helpful in whatever label you're trying to think about. And when people are answering these questions, we want them to think about getting information from family, from the community, where we're not just thinking about what are we doing as the providers that help that person, but what might be happening, like if they have a particular faith leader that has embraced them in some way. What would you say are some of the things that actually help them? And so what we can do is that it helps us to correct the information that is available for people. We can give correct information, for example, that people do get well. We can, in those different groups that you were just talking about earlier, we can bring people together and let them learn about each other. When we're pointing out differences, we can point out differences in a way to talk about the strengths and not just pointing out differences in terms of the things that get in the way. And we can ask questions around why someone might be acting out in this particular kind of platform. Do they really have to conform to what that stereotype might be, and correct that information? And all of this takes the skill of dialogue, right? All of it kind of goes back to where we started when we first got on this webinar about how do we go about doing this. It's about dialogue and asking a different kind of question. And we won't be able to get very far unless we're able to do that. In order to give the correct information, we kind of need to know what information people are working with to start off with. And it also allows us to think about, as I said earlier when we were looking at the picture with the kids looking over the fence, ask a different kind of question. An area of culture, diversity, or competency that doesn't get talked about very much is poverty. And when we think about poverty, we need to think about poverty not just on a financial level, but also on what kind of relationships people have, on what kind of information they have about where they can, get a loan or have access to healthcare things that they may not realize that they have access to. Think about the spiritual things that might be supporting them, or the importance of, whole health action management, right? WHAM, we do a lot of that in Georgia. The physical wellness and other supports that people might need in their communities. So I like to make sure that when I talk about cultural competency, that I also mention dimensions that are outside of just race and ethnicity or gender, but that we're also thinking about the communities that we come from, the way that we understand what resources are and how resources can be relationships and information, and not just financial. Any thoughts, questions? Because I know we are, well, this is the part I'm hoping we'll have a little dialogue on.
I think it's we're really pleased that you talked about poverty in a broad sense, because I think we often think of poverty as people, not having access to financial resources. But really, when you think about poverty and deprivation, I mean, it exists along, a whole range of issues, in terms of, for example, I guess the piece about, the physical piece and how people may, their health is impacted, or the spiritual piece where folks have, kind of disconnected from the spiritual self, or, religious institutions, and really what does that mean when a person is, quote unquote, poor in that way, and what kinds of things. And I think it also impacts on how you can support people to become rich, not just necessarily in a financial way, but in all these other ways, that you can really have a person really, identify or build assets that have nothing to do with the bank account.
That's right. Yeah. And that when, even as an organization, we can feel like we don't have resources. Like transportation comes up over and over and over again. We need to be able to help provide people with transportation, and especially if we think about like rural areas. And what I find is that when we only think about transportation defined in one particular way, then we can get stuck. But, look at Uber, look at some of the ways that people have come together to actually create transportation access that they may not have thought about before. I just recently had a chance to go visit it's a new museum down in Montgomery, and they talk about the use of finding cars that were not being used, which were primarily cars that were used in funeral homes during the Montgomery bus boycott, right? And so this is a resource that they were able to put in place so that people could get to work and not use traditional transportation. Some of the organizations I've worked with created just a database of who has a car, who was willing to give somebody a ride, and support them in getting help when they needed it. So the recovery community often will show up if we ask them to show up in creative, innovative ways. We're working with an organization now that has a partnership with the church. And the church uses their vans on the weekends, but not during the day. So 2 days during the week, they have this contract now to use the vans to support their individuals getting back and forth to recovery supports. And that is including going to the hair salon, going grocery shopping. It's outside of just the traditional things that we think about for transportation. And it's really like creating a space not only for people to connect with a resource in the community in a different kind of way, but also to get what they need, and then to do this in a very innovative way. But it started off by really looking at, well, what are some of the things that people use or need, and what are some opportunities, what are some untapped ideas that we might be able to use related to that? Mm-hmm. So just to, kind of quickly share an example of what that can be. But I would love if, now or later, if you think about how this information might help you build relationships with others, if there is a way that we think about how our filters, or even introducing different terms and terms and various terminology to say that we can be agile, or we can tell stories differently about what it means to be aware of our filters and aware of the historical legacy that we're all living in. In this work, it's also important, I think, with the middle question here, that sometimes our expectations can create tension with the people that we're trying to serve. And so culturally, we need to be aware of whether or not our goals, like somebody having a particular kind of bank account or a particular kind of job or the kind of relationship, if they're setting healthy boundaries, maybe there may be some room for being informed from a cultural lens on that, and that not everybody wants to or needs to live in their own home, by themselves, that maybe there is something to living in community, for example, and that we can use this information to help repair the relationships that we have with others, depending on our awareness of what we mean by being culturally competent.
Well, Dietra, I was just going to add, what I love about this is really the focus on our own filters, right? Really being aware of what that is when I'm engaging with someone else or a group of other people, and then being able to not just be aware of mine, but to step back and be more objective as to how they're showing up, and not make immediate assumptions about their motivations, and just allow myself to say, oh, okay, so maybe they're showing up from a different place. Why don't I just ask a question about what's happening instead of making an assumption that might lead me down the wrong path?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I like to try to be aware of what information they're coming in with, and what they might be sharing with me might be based on what they think, I want to hear. So they'll give me goals that are based on their years of being in the, being institutionalized, instead of really thinking about life goals. And that all of that actually has something to do with being culturally kind of in tune, to use another term, that we're not just trying to kind of create a cookie cutter here, although there, we could have a variety, to use in different kinds of ways. I think we have some comments coming.
Folks are writing. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Yeah, good. So Sarah, Marvin, and Melissa say that they really like the idea about self-reflection too, and they like to challenge our team members to look at their filter and expectations for a particular client and take a step back to what is the client experience perspective, which is what you were talking about, Dietra. Both and Adria is stepping back, and really being able to, to look at the other person's kind of point of view, where they're coming from. Yeah, that sounds like they're using really great strategies.
Yeah, Yeah.
But Dietra, I guess the question I have, and you may be going to get, I mean, how do you repair once you kind of really realize that, you committed a faux pas, or you said the wrong thing, or, made different assumptions. And, I know for me in the work that I do, when I look at kind of some of the assumptions is around sexual identity. The assumption that if you're speaking with a woman, that the partner is a man, and vice versa, or how someone presents. That if they present physically, or a woman, of really, or I can often think of when I've worked with transsexuals, it's one of the challenges staff will often have is really addressing folks in their preference. If she, and really being attuned to that and really being careful. But what happens when you kind of screw it up the first time around? I mean, what can you do? Because it's hard.
Well, I love that. And I think one of the first things that I like to let people know about when we think about this work is that we are going to make mistakes, and that we are human. So we're going to, even with all of the training, there are going to be things that we do unintentionally that will rub someone the wrong way. And you could be trying to be as culturally, agile and in tune as there's just something that will happen. I think the thing I look for, and I hope that people start to do a little bit more of, is to be able to say, I'm sorry, to be able to acknowledge that they have made a mistake and that they want to repair it, and that they ask, what can I do to help? And that we don't always do that. We want to kind of be ahead of the game instead of being next to people with the things that we're trying to do. And that we have to, I think it was noted earlier, both be patient and I think also work as a team, that you are continuously trying to learn, that you don't just say, I'm sorry, and then you actually don't change what you do, because that can break trust, right? Like there are a lot of organizations who will say, we're going to do something about this, and then they don't find a way by including the person who was harmed in developing what the actual action for repair is going to be. Because the person, there's a responsibility for the repair on both sides. It's not simply from the person initially. There's also this piece for some of us of actually saying, ouch, like actually speaking up that something was hurtful or was uncomfortable. And that we have to give people sometimes permission to learn how to do that. And that as the provider or the person who is running an organization or leading the meetings or being the expert, if that's what it is, the role that you're in, that you take a proactive kind of approach of acknowledging that there are going to be things that may not, that you're going to be human and that may not be going very well. And to actually ask, like, what would be a way that we could do this? Do we need to learn how to have sort of a talking stick or a comment box? Because some people are not going to be ready to repair right away. Do you know what I mean by that? It's going to take them a little bit of time to heal or to kind of get a different perspective. And so you have to let people have that time in their own way. But more than anything, I like to, just like being culturally competent, you want to have a lot of different things and many different pathways for thinking about how you're going to make a repair. But one of the first things is to be aware that you can make a mistake, and that as humans and as we keep adapting, we're going to do that. I have a 10-year-old, and I am being, retaught things all the time that apparently I do wrong, right? And I have to be open to that, right? We have to allow ourselves to learn different ways. I often share the story that when I was first working in New Jersey, I had done 1 degree in the Midwest, and we were kind of conditioned at that time to introduce ourselves as African Americans. I go to New Jersey, and the more inclusive term was Black. And so there, geographically, things are going to be different in terms of what we, how we identify.
Hey, Dietra, can you also share on how you create a safe space for people to say they've been harmed in some way? Because I think that so often people actually don't share that that something was an ouch. And I know you spoke to it a little bit earlier with the oops and ouch. You mentioned that, but I'm thinking that sometimes people actually don't know that they can say that.
So I think it's important, even though people don't always recognize the importance of this, but the 2 things that I think are important in doing this work is what I tried to do in the beginning here. I set for you where I'm coming from first. So I kind of laid out where I'm coming from in the work that I'm trying to do. And then the next thing that we often do, other than just asking what are your hopes for being here, because that's one way to kind of elicit that I'm going to listen to you first, so you're modeling that from the beginning, is that we actually create how we're going to communicate with each other. We start off all of our work and all of the workshops that we do and the people that we do any engagement with, we ask them, what are some ways in which we can best communicate with you? What's going to be comfortable? How do we, what would be some ways in which if you are uncomfortable, you could let us know? We try to, for different groups, we'll build in more breaks or less breaks based on that. We might, I always try to come with, as you can see here, more than one person in doing the work so that we can meet people and be available in what we're doing. And I introduce things as well. So we'll introduce things like an oops or an ouch or being able to say my bad, and we'll practice it. So practice is the other piece. And they have to see that modeled, with each other on how to have a conversation, how to say I'm sorry or an oops, and then take a step back in order to repair. So I'm glad you asked that question, though, and for that reflection, that we just try to have a big toolkit available. And when I've done more sort of the practice work, it's really setting in everyday language what they can expect from me, and also, and from our organization or the support that they're going to get. And if they have something that they want to talk about, we give them multiple ways in which they can give that feedback. So not just saying that, you have to come to the person in charge, but that there are multiple ways in which they can give feedback and then get support for what they can do. And that the question is always first, what do you think would help you? What's going to help us be able to move forward, as a question that people can use. So I know we only have like a couple of minutes left. So I did want to offer these strategies as well, which I think I've kind of been talking about a little bit. And if there are other questions, we're happy to answer things through email later. Ask people how to build trust, like what does that look like? And sometimes that's team building activities, and sometimes it's just being on time. Sometimes it's recognizing that on time is different because culturally time is different for us, right, depending on where you're coming from. I think a key thing, though, that helps with everybody is to give accurate information and to be mindful that you're sharing information with everybody and not just with one group. Don't assume that if you give information to like a team lead that it then spreads out to everybody, but think about how to give accurate information and share that information with everybody that you are interacting with. Take time to recognize the importance of self-care. You can't, I think it's a hard thing to ask someone else to do things you're not willing to do yourself. So if you're not taking your own mental health day, how are you going to expect someone else to do that? If you're not willing to step up when somebody steps on your toes, how are you asking someone to do that? Use technology in a variety of different ways, and also be mindful of whether or not you're flooding people with that technology. And then look for ways to be as innovative as you can. And sometimes innovation is little things like actually posting notes in the bathrooms, or, giving people balloons and saying that you hope that they, feel lifted today. That there are all kinds of different things that we can do for that. And the last thing that I like to share with people is we're always looking at various TED Talks and stories to share. And this one came out just last year, I think in December or so. And it's about a psychiatrist in another country who recognized that he could not be effective in meeting everybody's needs if he expected people to come to him. So I just encourage people to watch this TED Talk, and the question to be thinking about is, what is the innovation that you hear here? What was the inspiration, and how can that inspiration inspire us to look outside of our typical ways of doing things and recognize that we might have resources in abundance, as he said, he's abundance of grandmothers, that he could provide support to, and that they could be the mechanism for supporting the community. It's a really wonderful talk about innovation and kind of getting away from the way that we typically try to provide support, and I think is done in a manner that is definitely thinking about his community and what would work in that community.
And one of the things, I think it's a great, that particular, I looked at it, the video, the YouTube video, and one of the things, and I'd like to encourage folks, is that it's really apropos to a lot of your approaches, and including family members as family partners or peers as peer specialists. It really speaks to basically how, when there are not limited, but resources that may not be available all the time to everyone for different reasons, that, you have, people in the community who really are able to, who traditionally have been the source of support and who really are eager to really step up. And they may do things a little differently, but, everyone's getting to the same place. And, and so I would really recommend that folks really, because I think it brings home really what essentially peer support and community support is really about. Coming from a totally different culture.
Right. Merge with all the other pieces, right? Like that's what's exciting about it. You look outside of what those resources are, and then you provide that extra component and bring in technology. And then you've got like this this really special golden moment of support, of being able to provide care in a way that's even better than what's done traditionally.
All right. Well, thanks. I think, go ahead. We're going to let you close.
Yes, I always close.
We just have a few announcements, and then we're going to let you bring it on home, because I think it's appropriate that you do it. Is that, for those of you that are on the call, our next webinar is going to focus on SOAR, which it'll be on the 10th of August. Time did we're not sure of the time. I think we reworked the time, but that will be the last webinar of the year, and it'll give me, Ashley, and Amelia time to kind of regroup, as well as to kind of, to figure out for you all to help drive what we plan for next year. However, I think this is a good way to close today's session, so I'll turn it over to Dietra, and you can close it out.
Thank you. I just like to always recognize and end that there is hope, and that there are more resources out there than we realize. Continue to be mindful of the different terms that we have and the power of our words and what we ask. Practice asking for a different story. Listen and believe. So practice those dialogue skills and recognize when you are being pulled into a debate. And know that innovation is possible, especially if we think outside of our box, like we redefine the way we typically think about poverty and take that in a much broader perspective. So I just want to thank you, and if you're interested in any information, we do have a website, drdietra.com. you can get information about the kinds of work that we do there, as well as a link to One Small Change. And
Good.
we're grateful for this opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarah, Marvin, and Melissa said thanks. That's really good. So
Thank you.
Dietra and Adria, just want to say thank you. I mean, I said you've done a few sessions for us on, well, one on motivational interviewing, but also on cultural competency. And each time I learned something different. And I think one of the things we really want to, today's session, was really very much tailored to folks that these programs are really working with. And I just want to thank you for really, because sometimes you have a webinar and folks have to kind of struggle hard to say, well, how can this apply to my work and what I do? And you both did a really good job of really talking about, some of the experiences that folks have and how it really can apply to assisted outpatient treatment programs as they move forward, whether it's about really understanding the culture of folks who spend a lot of time in inpatient or state hospitals